like the furniture in the background, or you wish I'd chosen a different curtain, you can send me that in a private message later. Anyway, I'm going to offer the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We acknowledge God as the source of the universe, who among the many gifts of creation gives us the capacity to understand and to study, to discuss, and to question about the big issues of life. A loose translation of the blessing. So, what I provided for this year is 4 pieces of paper, 7 sources. The text topic is Mastering and Managing Anger, some Jewish sources. And I base this on the passage that recurs in the High Holiday Liturgy that we'll come to in a moment. In the prayer book, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum B'Chanun, Erech HaPayim B'Rav Chesed V'Emet, Notzer Chesed La'alafim, Nosei Avon V'Fesha, and so on. The section that is normally repeated, especially on Yom Kippur, many times, and during the Torah service as well, unless it's on Shabbat. So that's a passage we see in the prayer book, but it is, like many things in the prayer book, something that's been lifted from the Torah and transposed from one setting into another. And as often happens when a text that is written for or edited into one place of sacred literature is kind of airlifted out and moved across, millennia and dropped into a different book for a different purpose in a different setting, the identical words take on a sometimes different meaning. So I thought we would roll back to where the text originates and the nature of the anger that it addresses, and have the context a little bit clearer for us. So we'll bring up the source sheet at this point on the screen, and you should see the text from Exodus chapter 32, beginning at verse 7. Great, there you go. So the Lord spoke to Moses and said, hurry down. So Moses is up on Mount Sinai. This is the whole episode of receiving the Torah, which, by the way, starts in chapter 20 of Exodus. So you can see we're now in chapter 32. This is a long time Moses has been on the mountain, which partly explains the anxiety of the community that may lead to their questionable behavior that's about to arise. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, hurry down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have acted basely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I enjoined upon them. They have made themselves a molten calf. We also know that as the golden calf, and bowed low to it and sacrificed to it, saying, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Lord further said to Moses, I see that this is a stiff-necked people. Now let me be, that my anger may blaze forth against them, and that I may destroy them, and I will make of you, Moses, instead a great nation. But Moses implored the Lord his God, saying, let not your anger, O Lord, blaze forth against your people. So you want to track the number of times the word anger occurs here. Let not your anger, O Lord, blaze forth against your people, whom you delivered from the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand. Let not the Egyptians say, God forbid, it was with evil intent that God delivered the Israelites, only to kill them off in the mountains and annihilate them from the face of the earth. Turn from your blazing anger, there's citation 2 now with an adjective to amplify, and renounce the plan to punish your people. Notice, by the way, in the beginning, God says to Moses, hurry down there, your people have made a calf. And now Moses says, don't punish your people. This is kind of like, the hot potato. Who owns this people in this text? Moses continues, remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, how you swore to them by your very self and said, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and I will give your offspring this whole land of which I spoke to possess forever. And the Lord renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon his people. So the text is kind of familiar. I hope if you don't recognize it from the Torah, you recognize it from the Cecil B. DeMille movie. This is one of Edward G. Robinson's classic starring parts. He's the guy down there with the golden calf when they come down the hill. One of my favorite scenes of all the biblical movies. Anyway, so what's going on here? God says, let my anger blaze forth. And then Moses says, let not your anger blaze forth. In fact, why don't you turn from your blazing anger? You know, you have a reputation to maintain here. And people are going to say the reason God really took them out of Egypt was so that God could destroy them in the wilderness. That will not reflect well on your deityhood. And if that's not convincing, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I mean, you actually made a promise there. So this doesn't reflect well on you with this community that you'd like to be loyal to this covenant that you're trying to establish. Why should they keep their promises if you don't keep yours? The interesting thing about this text that I never noticed until I put the source sheet together earlier last week is it then says the Lord renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon his people. So curiously, what happened to the anger? And this becomes not just a rhetorical question because the second half of the study session is about human anger. The first half we're dealing with God's anger, but you know, there's a connection here. So one of the questions of Teshuvah is when people make an apology and people say, okay, I forgive you, what does that imply about any anger that may be associated with that damaged relationship? We don't really have any information here about whether God's still angry. All we know is that God has renounced the punishment. So some clever editing going on here. Let me share another text with you, text number 2. We'll bring that up on the screen before we pause for any questions that may be going on there. I should just mention to you that I haven't opened the chat window, so I'm not seeing at the moment what's happening, if anything's happening in the chat, because that will pull my attention away. But when we make the pause, which we will in a few moments, I'll open the chat window and see what's doing there as well. So between Exodus 32, where Moses intervenes and they have this back and forth over who this people that's being disruptive and disloyal belongs to, we get to chapter 34. And this is the famous passage where Moses says, you know, it's a little bit like the movie Field of Dreams. If you remember that movie, like, you know, I've gone to all the work to do the stuff you asked by intervening and calling off this anger. So how come I don't get to go too? Like, I'd really like to see you, God, says Moses. And God, according to the writers of the Torah, says, nobody gets to see me face to face, but tell you what, I'll hide you in the cleft of this rock, and as I go by, you'll get to see me from the back. And that way, you know, you'll know that this is real, and that way you won't also be incinerated or evaporated by the kind of vision you're not allowed to partake of. So it says, God came down in a cloud and said, and stood with him there and proclaimed God's name. And this is where the passage in our liturgy comes from. And you have the Hebrew there, if that's comfortable for you to read. Vayavor Adonai el panav vayikra Adonai Adonai el rachum v'chanun erech apayim v'rav chesed ve'emet notzer chesed la'alafim v'nosei avon v'fesha v'chata'a v'nakei. And notice I put inverted parentheses there. Stay with that for a while. The parentheses aren't there in the Torah. In the Torah, it continues right on with what the Hebrew says. Lo yenakeh poked avon avot al banim va'al bnei banim al shlishim va'al rebeim. So all that translates as God passed before him and proclaimed, Adonai, Adonai, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Parentheses. That's what happens in the prayer book. In other words, let me tell you what's going on here. I think some of you probably already know this. In the prayer book, the quotation that's extracted from the Torah, airlifted across the generations and dropped in the book we call the Machzor, that quotation is very nicely cut off and edited by the editors of the prayer book. In the prayer book, all it says is God extends kindness to the thousandth generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, period, end of story. In the Torah, that's not the way the text reads. In the Torah, the text says, God forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, but does not remit all punishment, and instead visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children unto the third and fourth generation. So before we pause to see what kind of questions are coming up here, let me just make the observation, as you probably would see and understand, that when the rabbis picked up this text and moved it into the High Holiday Liturgy, they preferred to convey the message that sincere atonement, forgiveness, apology, teshuva, repentance, reconciliation, that's the close quotation. That's where the period in the sentence goes. God forgives, period. They didn't want to have the teaching, but God doesn't, totally forgive. There's stuff that's residual, that remains problematic. If it doesn't come back on you and your generation, it'll come back at some point down the line in the lineal descendants that emerge from your generation. So it's kind of interesting that, I'm always at pains to mention to our community, anytime people say, where do Reconstructionists get the right to change the liturgy? Because Reconstructionists did change a lot of the liturgy. I always like to point to this text and say, well, we started with a precedent that goes back 2,000 years ago when the rabbis migrated text from the Torah into the prayer book. They were quite comfortable changing the liturgy by adjusting how much of the text they migrated in. So we're just kind of following in that tradition. Okay, that's our first 10 minutes or so. Let me pause here. I'm going to turn to Helen, who should be unmuted, and she can forward any questions that might have come up.
There was just... Okay.
Gotcha. Okay.
So far, just one question, and I'm not sure I'm phrasing this one right. So Jay had asked or commented on the relationship to Rambam's quality of God. Qualities, the 13 qualities.
Yeah. Since we don't have any other questions pending, Caitlin, I'm asking Caitlin if you guys haven't met Caitlin. Caitlin's the person who is in charge of handling our Zoom. You may not see her, but we're all in her debt. Caitlin, if you're unable to unmute Jay Brodbar, if you can find him conveniently without scrambling, we can have him explicate his question briefly.
So,
hi, Jay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. I've always thought of this also when it happens during the Chagim Torah service, when it's not on a Saturday, that what we're really focused on here, I think it was Maimonides who chose these 13, and there are 13. You have to kind of count them kind of creatively, but there are 13 qualities, and he felt those were the 13 qualities of God, of which the ones you're focused on, especially in terms of forgiving agony, et cetera, are important. But I thought that was the basis for sort of parsing it that way.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Let me just mention back to Helen before I respond to your question that Joanne is just signaling to me that we should just make sure someone hasn't sent you a question, Helen, in your private chat list. So you can take a look. You can take a look there while I respond to Jay's question. So Caitlin, we can come back to me and take the camera off Jay. But thank you, Jay.
For this time, I don't have anyone spotlighted, so whoever is speaking, Zoom will automatically spotlight you. Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Although all I'm seeing at the moment on my screen is a picture of the synagogue at twilight, whatever that's worth. So the question that Jay is raising is when the rabbis look at the phrase that's in the prayer book that's lifted from the Torah, God is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, faithful, and so on.
They call that the Shalosh Esrei Midot. They count 13 attributes of God there. Like most significant numbers in the Bible, like the 10 Commandments, the 13 attributes, and the 12 tribes, the numbers are typological, and the correlation with what they are supposed to line up with is ephemeral, which is a snazzy way of saying that once the numbers are imprinted, you then have to figure out how they line up. So somewhere in that block of text, there's 10 commandments. Not so easy to find them, and Jews, Catholics, and Protestants don't count the 10 commandments the same way. The typology of the 12 tribes depends upon whether there's 12 or 13. If you count Joseph, you leave out Benjamin and Judah. If you leave out Levi, you count Benjamin and Judah. It gets very complicated. And so, Jay, to your question, finding 13 attributes of God here is a bit of a quotidian task. When it's extrapolated to what Maimonides in the 12th century calls the 13 statements of belief, the anima amins, whether he's working off the idea of 13 and replicating that, that's an interesting question to which I don't know the answer. It's a good conjecture, and it certainly seems plausible. Never occurred to me to ask, why does Maimonides have 13 and not 11, 12, or 14? Although 13 fits the song Yigdal really well, which is built on Maimonides' 13 principles. But I actually don't know if that's a correlation, but it's something to look up after Yom Kippur. So Helen, I'm going to come back to you for a minute and ask if there's anything else that's surfaced, and if not, we'll just go on to text number 3.
Okay, 2 questions. One, and you may be addressing this when we look at human anger, but is Jonah a study in reverse?
Great question. Whoever submitted that one, good for you. That's really good for like 2:30 in the afternoon on Yom Kippur. Yeah, actually, Jonah was in the running for the source sheet, but I know that Rabbi Grimberg probably is planning on saying something about Jonah later, so I left it out. Yeah, Jonah is actually, it's a good case study of what happens when God says, I'm willing to forgive them. What's your problem? Right? So yeah, Jonah is, and we're going to come to this a little bit in the human anger text, that Jonah is an example of a voice. I want to be careful about this because it's a writer saying what Jonah said and thought. Okay, so let's just stick with that for a minute. So it's a voice of the tradition in the book of Jonah that finds a Jewish perspective that teshuvah and atonement actually wipe the slate clean and let people start over. The person who wrote the book of Jonah wanted Jonah to be the voice that said, you've got to be kidding. Like, somebody's got to suffer. Like, nobody gets off without punishment. It's okay if you forgive them after you beat them up a little bit or whack them around, but nobody gets to just be let off the hook. That's the voice of Jonah. And the voice of the author of the book of Jonah is, yeah, that actually is the way it works. That's what Shuvah really is about. Helen, anything else there?
Yes, 2 questions that are somewhat similar, so I'll group them together. One is, can we look at war and COVID and inequality as being examples or reflections of God's anger? And the second is, why would God put the anger onto future generations? Or the punishment, not the anger.
Right, right. Yeah, good. No, it's good. So let me acknowledge the seriousness of the first question and not address it. Because it would take us into a long conversation about what do we mean by the word God in terms of a personal being, in terms of a power within us. I think most of Jewish tradition, I said I wasn't going to answer this, right? Most of Jewish tradition wants to shy away from direct cause and effect. X is happening because of Y. But that leads into your second question. The doctrine of Poked Avon Avot al Banim, that God visits punishment from one generation onto the other is qualified in the Ten Commandments. That's actually the first place that statement occurs. And the qualification there is, unto the third or fourth generation of those who continue to spurn God's ways. And by implication, therefore, not unto the third and fourth generation that continue to spurn God's ways. So to put this in humanistic terms, people who reach a certain stage in life usually become self-aware that something that happened in their family of origin, either directly to them or perhaps indirectly to other members in their family, was disruptive, perhaps to the point of being traumatic. And while they might not have been the direct recipient of that trauma, it lives in the system. It lives in the parents, it lives in the grandparents, it lives in what's spoken and often what's not spoken. And eventually it resurfaces in ways that sometimes are confusing, sometimes become clarified. As I mentioned last night in the sermon, it's one of the things with ghosts and ancestors to which we want to pay attention. That the things that we do have a residual effect going forward. And so I will just clarify this, and then what I'd like to do with everyone's permission, which you can't actually do, so that's a rhetorical request. I'm going to go back to the text after this just so we keep moving, because I'm keeping track of the time and I want to get to the human anger. But I do want to say that, again, from a Reconstructionist perspective in particular, of Judaism as an evolving religious civilization, that at the time of the destruction of the first temple, 586 before the Common Era, two of the most important prophets of Jewish tradition, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, explicitly repudiate the teaching that God visits the sins of the parents on the children. They repudiate it in a parable in which, for all of you who are dental folks out there, you'll appreciate the analogy. It will no longer be said that the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children now need orthodonture. That's, by the way, a loose translation, but it's pretty much what Jeremiah and Ezekiel say, by which they mean to say, going forward after this time of purging and punishment and the destruction of the temple, which will lead to reconciliation and restoration, while it used to be the case that the children suffered for the parents, going forward, that's not the way things will be. Everyone will be accountable for their own transgressions, and it will not be passed on to the children. So although it's a doctrine you can pull out of the Bible, please just keep in mind, as Jews who are comfortable with the idea that Judaism evolves and changes, that it's not where the tradition stopped. It's only where it started. So thanks for these good questions. Continue to submit questions to Helen or in the chat. And I'm going to invite you to come back to the source sheet, and we'll put that up on the screen now at citation number 3 on page 2. So we're now in the period of the Talmud and the rabbinic imagination. And this is from the first tractate of the Babylonian Talmud on blessings. And so these are originally, as many of you know, oral conversations. They get written down later on. So we're looking at conversations probably of the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. So Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, from where is it derived that one must not placate a person while he is in the throes of his anger? Here's a good teshuvah question for the high holiday period. When do you go approach someone if you want to make an apology? Rather, he should mollify him after he has calmed down. As it is written, when following the sin of the golden calf, Moses requested that the divine presence rest on Israel as it had previously. God said to him, my face will go and I will give you rest. Rabbi Yochanan explained this to mean, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, wait until my face of anger or wrath will pass, and I will grant your request. And therefore one must wait for a person's anger to pass as well. So the Gemara asks, which means there is no person called the Gemara. The Gemara, if the term isn't familiar, is the discussion that continues among generations of rabbis, as the Talmud's emerging, what's eventually going to become books, but it's a conversation. And when it says the Gemara asked, it means we don't know exactly who asked this question. So it's as if, the text itself asks. So that's puzzling. Is there an anger before the Holy One, blessed be He? Meaning, can we speak of God, who's above all such human attributes, using terms like anger? Can you say God is angry? The Gemara answered, yes, as it is taught, because here's a verse from the book of Psalms. God becomes angry as it is stated. God vindicates the righteous because God is furious every day. So just before I read the last section here, I was going to say that, this is an interesting phrase, meaning that what? There are some people who are angry all the time. It's just sort of their default disposition is to be offended, to be angry, to be upset. Or it's at least their default position to find at least one thing a day to be angry about. The alternative is to find one thing a day or make your default position to vindicate the righteous, find something to feel good about, or give people the benefit of the doubt. Anyway, the rabbis bring this verse from the Psalms, but they're not content to leave it there. So they ask rhetorically, okay, can God get angry? Answer is yes. How do we know? Because this thing in the Psalm says so. So now what do we do with that? How much time does God's anger last? Answer, God's anger only lasts a moment. Would that it would be for us, by the way. They ask, this is the Talmud. This is exactly the kind of question the Talmud asks. Okay, how long is a moment? Answer, please don't ask me to do this in Aramaic. 1/58,888th of an hour. That's a moment for God. And the Gemara adds, no creature can precisely determine the moment when God becomes angry. So this might touch on the question of whether, COVID, the environment, and everything else, that we're suffering through at this moment is an outpouring of God's anger. These kind of texts, I think, are cautions not to read into events for which more often than not, there's a natural and regrettably a human explanation for why things are the way they are. Don't read into that somehow it was caused by some power coming from heaven because God's angry about a specific thing. Because actually no human creature, the Talmud says, with some humility, can precisely determine the moment when God becomes angry. The other side of that is that it's hard to know the moment when God becomes forgiving. Let me read one additional text here, citation 4, if we can bring that up on the screen, and then we'll pause again for your questions or your comments. So I'm jumping several hundred years here now from the Talmud to a Hasidic text. I gave you the dates there for Levi Yitzhak of Berdechev, 1740 to 1810. So this is about 1,500 years later than the text we just looked at from the Talmud. But it goes together with that text. And this will wrap up the 2 pages of citations about God's anger. We'll pause for some questions, and then we'll spend the remaining time on texts about human anger and how they relate to Yom Kippur. So in the book of Genesis, chapter 8, which is the story of the flood and Noah, okay, God says after the flood's over, I will not again smite all living creatures in the manner as I have done. The Zohar, which is the classical root text of Jewish mystical commentary on the Torah, the Zohar zeroes in on the words Ka'asher asiti, that I, meaning God, have done, by reporting on a conversation between God and the Torah together, with which together he had created the universe when God said, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. So just do yourself a favor here and indulge the rabbinic imagination, which is that God and the Torah are having a conversation. You can't think rationally about this or the story won't work. Because if you start saying, the Torah isn't a person, how can the Torah have a conversation? You're going to get lost here. So you just got to go with what's going on here. So here's the imaginary conversation. The Torah is reported to have warned God. You got to love this. The Torah is reported to have warned God that man was liable to be sinful, thereby causing God to become angry, so that unless he were to restrain himself, man could never survive God's anger. God responded that this was why God employed the Torah as God's assistant in the process of creation, so that people would see that any reference therein to God as the merciful, patient God would not be an empty compliment. This is great. So this is a little bit of a dense text. Let me mention something about it, and then we'll pause for the questions. So this is part of a larger discussion that takes place in Jewish tradition, which is God having debates either with the Torah or with the ministering angels or with the prophets or with Satan. Same conversation, just different protagonists, about whether to create human beings. And, you know, there's pros and cons in each version of that conversation. In this one, the Torah is basically saying to God, if you go ahead with this thing on day 6 of creating human beings, you're likely to regret it because they're going to make you really angry. And so God says back to the Torah, it's okay. I'm going to write into the Torah that I'm forgiving and merciful, all the 13 attributes to which Jay called our attention earlier, that Moses will hear in his lifetime. And so they won't have to worry because they'll know that like the anger is kind of the loving anger of a parent. It's subject to remediation and it's not going to be eternal. So it's don't turn the page, but what I'm anticipating here is that the text is, Jewish tradition rather, is going to move from the discussion of God's anger to human anger by introducing the qualifying issue of not being permanent. And that's going to be the mediating and moderating factor around the experience of anger in Jewish tradition. That anger in and of itself is not evil, negative, inappropriate, never to be expressed, never to be displayed, never to be shown. It's not to be exploited, but it is to be expected because God and humans will spend eternity bumping up against each other and disappointing each other. And if that happens between God and humans, you and I know it happens between humans and humans. The question is, what do you do when that friction occurs? And that's partly why we're together on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, to think about what Jewish tradition says you do when that friction occurs and relationships are hurt and people are damaged and apology is required. Okay, let's pause here. I'm going to turn back to Helen and see where we are in questions and comments.
There was one question that was raised a little earlier, but it feeds right into what you just said, and that is in the text, when it said, you know, wants to wait for the person's anger to pass, what if we assume that the anger is not passing and it continues to fester? Has the individual then lost a chance to mollify and by offering an apology and asking for forgiveness, as it continues to fester, do you lose that opportunity? If you're waiting for it to pass.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. Thanks. I'm not sure who's asking these questions, but I really appreciate the nuance and the subtlety and the self-reflection that goes into the questions. I suspect for every question we're hearing, the person who asked the question is reflecting a lot of people's thoughts at the moment. So it's good. It's good. Yeah, the question of, you know, as it says in the Aramaic, after you, Alphonse, right? The question of who initiates the approach to mollify someone's anger. So you could make the case that someone's going to stay really angry. It's going to be visible in their face, or the energy is just going to come off of them. And the question is like, well, do I wait until they've calmed down to approach them? Or will my approaching them perhaps calm them down and make them susceptible to hearing the apology that I've come to try to offer. And there, as my wife has been, so helpful in reminding me, over and over again, everything's about relationships. So I think, Helen, the way the question's raised is really contextual to the relationship. If the relationship is such that it's not a huge risk to approach an angry person and say, I can see you're really angry. I'd like to have a chance to talk that through. If the relationship is strong enough to support that, then, I think you can take that risk. If the relationship is fragile or in damaged condition, or perhaps is not well built or hasn't been around for very long, you sometimes need to have a pause. And then there's always the rabbinic option of sending a shaliach, someone who's an intermediary, who says, so-and-so really feels bad about such and such and would like a chance to apologize. Is that a conversation you're ready to have? And that can sometimes help with that. Was there something else there?
Yeah, two more. One comment came in before we return to the text, and I'd like to go back to it for a minute. Simon Shapiro raised the question about the translation of the forgive and yet not forgive in the future as being potentially interpreted, and I hope I get this right, Simon, that it's actually, the way that it's written in the Hebrew, it's more for emphasis. It's more that it's absolutely won't forgive, as opposed to partially forgive now and not in the future.
Yeah. It's a good catch, Simon, thanks. Yeah, if you know something about Hebrew grammar, and even if you don't, let's take my word and Simon's word for it. The Hebrew construction, nakeh lo yinakeh, is an emphatic. It means you better believe I'm not going to forgive. And again, keeping in mind that Judaism is a conversation, it's not a doctrine, which I really hope, is like, if you remember, a few of the things we've discussed over our 40 years together, I hope that's one of them. If Judaism's a conversation, excuse me, the people in the conversation don't always agree. So nakeh lo yinakeh is the voice of people in the Jewish tradition who say, it's very nice you apologize. It's very nice you forgave that person. The fact is the damages are still there and the court orders restitution in the amount of X, Y, Z. Or, it's very nice that you guys, are sorry and made up, and the minimum sentence is 11 months in jail for what you did. There isn't an alternative. That's the way the law is written. That's the voice of Jonah, Helen, to which you referred earlier in one of the other questions. That's the voice that says somebody's got to pay. So yeah, in that construction, that's what's being said. The rabbis, in their evasive editorial way, are saying, we don't like that idea. We can't take it out of the Torah, God forbid, because the rabbis can't dismantle the Torah. So, but we can selectively quote the Torah, and in selectively quoting the Torah, we can reverse what the plain sense of the grammar means, which is what they do. Okay, so why don't we do one more, because I am aware that I cut off citation 4 in the middle of the passage because it continues on the next page, and we've got about 17 minutes and we need to cover some territory, but go ahead, Helen, you said you had one more.
One more, okay. This is actually a comment, and that was just a comment, I think, that is supporting what you had said, that perhaps we also need to recognize that one of the reasons to not interfere with or try to ameliorate the anger when it's going is that there should be a recognition that the person has the right to those feelings, and that forgiving in the middle of a flare may be too much to.
Yeah. We may end up skipping a text just for reasons of time this afternoon. But I will make sure to get to the final text on the last page. We're not going there yet, but we'll get there in a moment. Because that's from the Musar tradition, the tradition of cultivating attributes to fully develop your humanity in the way that Jewish tradition would like you to try to do. And I want to get to that text, and that's actually where I wanted to close. So Helen, I'm just going to defer that one slightly, because that's where the issue of, well, how do you, remember, I call this managing and mastering anger. I didn't say eliminating, avoiding, and being embarrassed about anger. That's not the name of the source sheet this year. Okay. Although, you know, it's that's a problem for many people. Many of us grew up in homes where anger was never shown to be a normal, acceptable human reaction to something. And it takes a while to learn, you know, how to do that, to do it well, to do it safely. You know, two people who fall in love, partner, and marry, and one comes from a family tradition where the parents, you know, fought all the time and, you know, still managed to love each other and keep their relationship together, you know, brings one model of, you know, how you manage that kind of set of dynamics in a relationship. And if they happen to marry someone who grew up in a family where, you know, no one ever yelled at anybody or got angry about anything, they bring a really different model. And, you know, that's a couple that's going to have to work on figuring out how to negotiate and navigate, you know, disagreements and disappointments. Okay, Helen, thanks for the questions and for, you know, batching them for us. We have, let's see, where are we? Okay, we have about 12, maybe 15 minutes, but of course we don't want to run into the 3 o'clock yoga session that's scheduled after this. Although I guess yoga would be a good place to go if you were angry that I ran overtime. It'll be the right place to go to ameliorate. But I want to respect Karen's time there as well. So Caitlin, can I ask you to bring up page 3 on the screen for a moment at the top of the page there, which is the continuation of the Levi Yitzhak text that we were reading. So just so you can see where this one ends, this debate between God and the Torah ends. I'm going to let you read this one on your own. But the short version of this is the rabbis come to a consensus, not an agreement. The rabbis never come to an agreement. They come to a consensus. Good policy, by the way, for synagogue board meetings. You never get universal agreement, but consensus is nice. The rabbis come to a consensus that God decides in all of these cases I gave you, in debate with the angels, in debate with the Torah, in debate with Satan, you know, in debate with whatever, that it's okay to create human beings because God has 2 primary attributes, mercy and justice. And the deal is God says to God's self, okay, I tell myself the following. If I'm going to go ahead and create human beings according to Jewish tradition, because God's lonely, I agree to govern the world primarily by compassion and not by justice. And so out of that negotiation, you know, we get this constant sense of you are expected to behave well, you're expected to accept the consequences for not, but the default emotional attitude of God towards human beings, I'm using all of this language poetically, by the way, I don't mean it literally, will always be leaning towards compassion, forgiveness, understanding. Okay, so we're going to scroll up slightly, and I brought you citation number 5. Now I'm backing up to the rabbinic period. Pirkei Avot, affectionately known as chapters of the fathers. I like to neutralize the gender and call it insights of the ancestors. Is a tractate of the Mishnah. So at the latest, we're looking at the year 200 of the Common Era. And in Pirkei Avot, you know, Pirkei Avot is kind of like Jewish fortune cookies, except they're useful and they don't have lottery numbers on the other side. So this one says there are 4 kinds of temperaments: easy to become angry and easy to be appeased. There are some people who, you know, you can set them off with the slightest comment and you can disarm them with the slightest apology. In that case, the gain disappears in the loss. Then there's the person who it's hard to become angry and it's hard to appease. You got the person that, you know, no matter what you do, they just don't seem to get angry. They're like saints until they're not, in which case they go from, like, you know, 0 to 100 on the anger meter, and it's really hard to dial them back. Their loss disappears in their gain. Then there's the third kind of person, the one who's hard to become angry and easy to be appeased. The person that, it'll take them days to get angry, what someone else will get angry about in the first 5 minutes. Okay? And when they do get angry, which is so unusual because you have to really, really push them, they're really easy to dial back, to talk down. And they are called in Pirkei Avot a chassid. They are pious people. It doesn't mean that they're chassidim like, Lubavitch. They're just pious people. That's category 4. Easy to become angry, or you can set them off with anything, and hard to be appeased. You can send 5 apologies, 10 apologies, 20 intermediaries, all right? They're not interested in your apology. And tradition calls them a rasha, right? The other place the tradition talks about the rasha is the 4 children at Passover, right? The 4 children of Pesach. And remember, the rasha is the one who says, what does all this stuff mean to you? You could apply the same thing here. Like, what do I care what you have to say, you who have come to apologize? Anyway, you don't have to figure out which of these 4 people you are, or the person that, you perhaps live with is, or which kind your parents were, or what kind your children are, or the people that you work with. But they're typologies. And that's the way that Pirkei Avot often works. It likes to break things down into categories. So I just thought you would enjoy that one. So let me tell you what's in citation number 6. We'll bring that back up on the screen for a moment because we're not going to have time to read it. You have that one that we can screen share? Here it comes. Okay. So I told Helen when she very kindly accepted this invitation to moderate that I never get through a 4-sheet source sheet handout in a 1-hour study session, unless I skip something. So I'm going to skip something, in which case I'll come to the end. I just want to tell you what's in citation number 6. I invite you to read it on your own. It's from the book Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Upright, by the scholar named Lutzato. And you can get it in English translation. It's a really nice current volume edited by Rabbi Ira Stone. And I invite you to track it down on your own. From one of the founders of the Musar movement, which is dedicated to cultivating through specific practices. Today we would call them spiritual practices, like you might do in contemplative practice or meditative practice. The kind of attributes that you'd like to live by more often than not. In the same way that you build up muscle memory, for the kind of things you want to do, Musar is dedicated to developing and strengthening midot memory, what's called midot in Hebrew, attributes. Anyway, we're not going to spend time on this one only because of not having enough time, but if we're going to, I'd like to scroll down to page 4 in the middle now, citation 7, which is our last text. And I don't know if I'll have time for comments or questions after this, for which I apologize. So a book that recently came out, published by the Reform Movement, you can find this online now available during the afternoon if you shop on Yom Tov, and after Yom Tov if you don't. It's called the Musar Torah Commentary. Different rabbis, each Torah portion has a different commentary by a different rabbi or teacher. It's edited by Rabbi Barry Block, and the commentary here is by Rabbi Mari Chernow, and it takes us back to where we started. She writes, I think this is a she, by the way. I actually don't know that. I don't know if this is a he, she, or they, for which I apologize, both to you and to Mari. I should have checked that. In any event, Rabbi Chernow writes, as with every midah or attribute, we are in search of the appropriate place and space for anger. The ideal presented in Exodus 34, that's what we read earlier, is slow to anger. That is, anger that is tempered by thoughtful consideration. Our goal is to avoid either underreacting or overreacting to anger. And this is, if you want Musar in a bumper sticker, it's the middle path. Musar is almost always going to direct us towards the middle path. If we tend to overreact, then we might consider the wisdom found in the book of Proverbs, which says, better to be slow to anger than mighty, better to have self-control than to conquer a city. we might seek strategies that help assuage our anger before we react. That's in contemplative practice, Jewish and otherwise, what's known as counting to 10, or the pause to notice your impulse to respond before you've had a chance to think through what you actually want to say by way of reacting. So someone asked earlier, about what happens when you can't assuage people and so on. This is part of the Jewish Musar response to that, which is to think through and notice what's going on in your body, in your feelings, in your mind before you say something, so that you can sort of process it a little bit. So Rabbi Chernow continues, if we tend to underreact, then we might examine how to prioritize our own needs. If we never get angry, we may have an overabundance of humility or compassion. Interesting, right? An overabundance of humility or compassion. Who would complain about someone who has an overabundance of humility or compassion? But the Musar tradition here says, don't go too far in that direction either. Because it says if we never get angry, there may be anger under the surface, with the power to control us just as much as overt anger does. Our task is to give honor to anger, but not too much power. That's a really nice phrase. I wish I had thought of it. Our task is to give honor to anger, not to deny it, not to embarrass people who are experiencing it, not to reject it, to give honor to it, but then not to give too much power to it, but rather to listen to it carefully without wholly deferring to it. And then, as you almost always find in Musar, Hasidic, and other Jewish pietistic literature, to find within even anger sparks of holiness. Because as Jewish tradition is fond of saying, if God is everywhere and in everything and is one, then you can't just have God in the good things or the easy things or the kind things. You have to find God, even if the sparks are faint, in the difficult things and the difficult people and the difficult moments. So we have 1 minute, according to my clock. So I'm going to thank you for your time. I want to thank Helen for moderating. And I want to thank Joanna and Caitlin for keeping us running on screen and keeping the text in front of us. I don't know if the chat will stay up so that we have a chance to take a look at the comments that came in there. And as I did last night, I will encourage you, if you'd like to continue the conversation with me, either during the holidays, if you use the computer, this afternoon, and if you don't, that's fine too. You can just send me an email. Email address for me is Richard, middle initial A, Hirsh, Hirsh, Richard A. Hirsh @gmail.com. And we can continue a conversation around a point that you might have had that we didn't have an opportunity to get to, or perhaps that you didn't want to ask through the public chat. And I'd welcome an opportunity to continue that conversation with you.